right. Well, hopefully there's a few folks out there that are ready to watch this little live stream I'm going to do really quick. So, started out with the idea to make a video, but I thought, well, I would take some input here as I'm going along. I got a few minutes here this morning and just sorting tackle and everything else, and thought I would talk a little bit about drift bobbers and different stuff like that. So, um, I got quite a few different styles, but I have four of my go-tos here, and they're not necessarily the sizes I always use, but these go-tos are the ones that I really enjoy using a lot, and they seem to be really effective at catching fish. So I got them spread out here. One of the things I was going to talk about, though, is references. And I think before you begin any kind of fishing, especially when you start talking about different styles of fishing, obviously YouTube's a really good resource. I like to point people in the direction of doing some of their own research in those resources, checking out that kind of stuff. And one of the biggest things that I think is really important is to find the way that's going to work best for the style that you want to fish, whether that be nymphing and fly fishing, dry fly fishing, swinging flies, however you want to do that, or in conventional fishing. If you're wanting to throw spinners and spoons, that's another way you can go. Or like what I'm going to talk about today are different types of what we call drift bobbers for drift fishing, which is what we predominantly use for salmon and steelhead. And I don't have every single drift bobber in the world, but I do have four of probably the most popular drift bobbers that are commonly used. Now there's a variety of colors, a variety of shapes, a variety of applications for these drift bobbers, and I can show you a couple different ways that these are actually set up and kind of talk a little bit about what those entail. But I want to start out with a really solid reference, and this is a book that's written by a guy. His name's Bill Hertzog, and Bill Hertzog he writes for the Salmon Trout Steelheader magazine. This magazine here, he puts out a lot of great stuff, and he's known around our parts as being like the guy with steelhead. And there's a lot of folks that can catch a lot of steelhead, but Bill's really pioneered opening up a lot of the information for steelhead. That's not to say that there isn't other great authors out there that write a lot of stuff, but Bill has been very pioneering in really giving all of us anglers an opportunity to actually learn how to steelhead fish. So he put out a book. I'm just going to look at it here. He put out a book. Let's see. It's not really giving me a date. 1994. 1994 is when this was published, so it's probably a little bit earlier than that. But the information's really relevant. And it's this book here. It's the color guide to steelhead drift fishing. Obviously, you see that nice steelhead there. The steelhead in its mouth, it has what we call a corky and some yarn on a hook. Very well could have had some bait on that hook as well. But drift fishing is basically allowing your bait to free drift through a run. And it presents it in a very natural way, such as salmon eggs on a hook. And those eggs will just kind of drift down through the run, and it's a lot of fun to when you get the bite, because sometimes fish will peck. Sometimes they'll load up and grab really hard. Sometimes they'll bump, they'll swim back, they'll come back around, and they'll jackhammer. Steelhead are one of those fish that they never cease to amaze me, and so one of the big things is that with this type of publication, you can find these. Obviously, Amato Media sells those books. If you live here in the Pacific Northwest, you can probably go to any one of your local tackle shops or fishing stores. You can go online and you can pick up this book. And it's a fantastic resource. I've learned a lot from this book. Not only that, but also just getting out there and walking the banks and talking to a lot of the old timers. I'll see, one of the first things I do is I look at, okay, what's everybody got tied on here? And I see a whole variety of different things. So it's not to say that there's one do-all to catching fish, just with anything. But you start getting a better idea if you start seeing fish dead on the bank, for our keeper fishery, or if you're seeing rods bent over and fish tail dancing through a tail out or through a pool or something else. Whatever that person's using might be a good place to start. Now, the techniques, weights, everything else, it's all going to be dependent, but we're just going to talk about these drift bobbers. So in the color guide to steelhead drift fishing, one of the cool parts of this is that it gives you a little bit of a history on these drift bobbers. And when we go through and we look at the different types of stuff, this is what we would consider to be our terminal gear or our rigging. And we get into things that are really get deep into the weeds. A lot of technical stuff. A lot of people are like, well, I just tied on a hook and threw this out there and, I'm trying this. One of the biggest things, though, is that when we start talking about rigging for drift fishing, one of the biggest things that happens to most people when they start out is hanging up. So hook selection and hook size, we're not going to go over that today. We're just going to go over these drift bobbers. But a lot of great resources in here. I'm going to kind of start out here with the first and foremost. And this is probably one of the most quintessential drift bobbers that has ever been produced. And that would be what we call a corky, which is basically a round styrene float. And this is what we call a drift bobber. You'll see that on the end there, it's got a hole through it. And that's where your line passes through. And believe it or not, you could fish these alone with some scent or unscented, depending on how aggressive the fish are. Typically, the way that I use these is actually to give a little bit of bait some buoyancy in the drift. That way the bait isn't hanging up in the rocks. This is actually floating the bait. They come in a variety of different sizes. There's some big corkies, there's little corkies. They come in a lot of different sizes depending on what you want to do. They can also be used as what we call a bearing on a spinning glow. But in general, I'll hold up two different sizes. So this is a fairly small one, and they do go smaller, but you can see the size differences. And they come with a variety of different colors for extra attraction during the drift and everything else. So a corky is a really dynamite setup. You can see that kind of that blue pastel or blue satin color. That's a really hot color too. But this corky here, this one mimics kind of a pattern of maybe a rainbow trout or juvenile trout or something like that, where it actually has the spots. So, and it's got that glitter in it and everything else. One of the most effective drift bobbers ever made was the corky. So that's the first one I wanted to talk about. And they've been around a long time, and they go down from size 14 to size 4, basically. So going to the next one is probably one of the most iconic, and I've seen a couple shorts where people have tested these out, which is cool because this is probably the most nostalgic lure I have ever used. This is what I very first learned how to fish with, and that's what we call the spinning glow. And now a spinning glow is a drift bobber also in certain circumstances. This one's small, but I'm going to pull out one that we would use more for Chinook salmon, and in this configuration it's actually rigged up to be trolled behind a boat. It's got a wire shaft, got a little bead down there, and that bead serves as a bearing. So when it's being pulled against the current, this is spinning. And it's not an aggressive spin like a metal spinner, but what it does, and you can see we got a big treble hook rigged on there. A salmon has a hard mouth, and this is really, this size we're targeting Chinook or king or blackmouth salmon or coho salmon or sockeye salmon. So we're targeting a little bit more aggressive, a little larger species with this size. Now, that's not to say that this size couldn't not be drifted if you wanted to drift fish for salmon, but chances are you will get steelhead on this size in really dirty water. But this is probably not going to be your first go-to on any kind of like steelhead. It's going to be a smaller drift bobber, something like this, what we call a Michael Jackson. This is the black and sparkle color with the little mylar wings. So this has got, some of them have mylar. So this is a mylar wing. This one here has more of a pliable rubber wing. But these work exceptionally well to give your bait buoyance. And we'll typically run a smaller size, but this one is at the top range of the size. So This one is like a aught or a two. I think this is about a size two spinning glow. But with those reflective mylar wings, if I was to rig this, especially in what we call a plunking setup, this would be a very effective, and this is a very effective color for spring Chinook, fall Chinook, coho. But in the smaller sizes, you can use those to help give some attractant and kind of move through the drift. Next one I want to talk about is probably the most iconic drift bobber ever made, and these have been around for quite a while. They were originally manufactured by Lure Jensen, and so there's some other products, but Lure Jensen made a pre-tied rig, and this is what we call an okie drifter. And an okie drifter, this is a big one, by the way. This is a very large okie, but this one has the buoyancy, but it also can be fished alone with some scent on it. You can put some anise, or you can put some egg scent, or even shrimp scent on this with a little bit of yarn or something like that. But basically, similar to the corky, it has a hole that's pre-manufactured through this. But these have been one of the most iconic steelhead fishing drift bobbers to date, and Mr. Hertzog actually was referenced as saying at one point that this was the original steelhead bead because of its likeness to roe or salmon eggs that have broke free out of the red that's drifting downstream. Now you could still get salmon on this. Salmon are going to attack it because it's a competitor egg in the red, or you don't want to fish reds, but their mind and their everything going on with a salmon changes when they get into fresh water. It becomes spawn. So they're going to attack competitor eggs. Same with steelhead. They're going to do that until they're running back out, and then they go through their cycle of feeding to beef back up and shoot back out to the ocean, rebright, and come back the next year to spawn again, because steelhead spawn multiple times. Salmon do not. They're a one-shot wonder, basically. A salmon will attack this. You put the right scent, put it in front of the fish. It looks juicy. It looks tasty. A salmon will attack it. Trout will really hammer down on these. And this is a big one. If you're going to be targeting low clear water fish, obviously smaller presentation, you get them down into this size, put a little bit of scent on them, and there's a variety of different colors too. You can throw something like this on there. But this is a hard plastic, basically, salmon roe mimicker. So one of my favorites, and I fish those a lot, and their buoyancy is excellent. You can fish them with bait, just the same as any of these other drift bobbers. You can fish any of them with bait, but it has just that nice, natural, subtle appeal. And so when you're swinging through the runs and everything else, you can kind of do that. Last one I'm going to talk about is one that's made by Bomac, and this is what we call a cheater. And it's basically just a little egg-shaped drift bobber, and they come in another variety of sizes and shapes. Now, I double purpose my cheaters, like these big ones here compared to these ones here. They come in a variety of sizes. They were originally developed in 1986 by Bomac, and Bomac made these so that you could float bait. Now, something like this, you're throwing a big old hunk of bait down there into the bottom of the run. And so we got our cheaters. These work really well. They can be fished alone once again, but you can see that they're kind of a smooth profile. Now they could be used as like an egg mimicker or something like that, but this is going to be more of a color attractant. It's also going to be more of a float attractant. Just a Fisherman 253. Thanks for stopping in. Just showing you guys a little bit about some of these drift bobbers. So if you're into salmon, steelhead, trout fishing, I'm showing you a couple different varieties and just explaining a little bit here. So we have these two different types of drift bobbers, and these drift bobbers work exceptionally well. Now, depending on your bait size. So your bait sizes are going to really determine buoyancy on your drift bobber. You can start small and work your way up. I would suggest doing that from personal experience rather than starting big and then trying to downsize. You're undoing a lot of terminal tackle back and forth when you're trying to adjust those drift bobbers. One of the things I do also is I actually go just do a couple test drifts real quick. And I'll even put the drift bobber down in the water in front of me. and I'll watch it. I'll see if it sinks down to the bottom. Let's say I'm running a large hook. So let's take, for example, I want to fish the okie in a size 3. Bill Herzog's favorite, pink nail polish number 3, okie drifter. Okie drifters are fantastic, like I was saying earlier. Now, with this, if I'm fishing a number 3 okie drifter, the biggest hook size that I want to go for is going to probably be a number 2, and even that is a little bit aggressive. But one of the biggest things is as the hook comes out, and I'll show you here on another spin glow setup that I have. If you're running a large hook, so your typical single point octopus bait holder, big river bait holder, whatever hook you want to use, or like an eagle claw, notice how that hook point is not only spaced by the 2 bearing beads there for the spinning glow, but it also extends past. The fish isn't necessarily attacking the hook. They're attacking this or the bait that's attached. You don't want to interfere with that hook setup. So what I mean by that is that you actually want that hook point to extend a little bit past the edge of the drift bobber itself, no matter what the diameter is. So if we're running like a big cheater like this, chances are we're going to be running with a 1/0 or 2/0 hook. So we have a good distance. Furious Flamingo, good morning. Thanks for joining. Make sure to hit the like button too, please. So we want our hook to extend past just a little bit there, okay? So that way when the fish comes up for the grab, they're going to get the hook first. This may interfere a little bit with their mouth closing, but they're going for that wad of bait as it's drifting through. So I don't sit there and necessarily say that pick number 2 hooks for number 3 size drift bobbers, okay? So if I'm sitting there saying, okay, so we have like a number 4 cheater here, all right? And we have a number 3 okie drifter. We could have 2 different diameters or very similarly the same. Pick your hook size to where your hook point's going to go just a little bit past that drift bobber. That's the key. A lot of missed hookups there, okay? Now, with other styles of drift bobbers, I'm going to show you another one here. Now, this one isn't as prevalent. Just a quick thing on that. The okie drifters are no longer manufactured. You can still find them, but the Lure Jensen ones, Lure Jensen stopped making these. Why? I have no idea why they did that. They were fantastic, and they worked good, and they were durable, and they were solid, and they gave bait float. But Lure Jensen decided to move away from it. This is a very particular type of drift bobber, and I've used these intermittently, but they do need to be used in conjunction with some type of bead bearing because they do spin. And this is what's called a Birdie drifter, okay? So let's say this presentation here is way too big, right? Obviously, we're not going to be fishing steelhead with this. We're going to be fishing salmon with like a number 2 or a single lot spinning glow, all right? But let's say, let me dig through the box of tricks here. Let's say we get down a little bit more into a steelhead size one. Maybe like this, okay? Maybe a good plunking setup. Well, maybe there's still too much profile or way too much float, but we still want to have some type of movement in our presentation. That's where this one comes in. Now, these ones are known as birdies or birdie drifters, and you can see that they have 2 helical wings on it. Okay, this is still a polystyrene drift bobber. It's got the hole punched through there. You run your line through that, and you put a little bearing down here. Typically, what you're going to do is you're going to run maybe a little bit of yarn off the back of this, and then scent that yarn. So you can scent that yarn with bloody tuna anise or shrimp krill scents or whatever you want to do, especially when you're targeting trout and steelhead. Anise is like the ultimate go-to scent. That's one that I really like to use a lot. I'll use it on soft beads. I'll use it on drift fishing setups. I'll even put anise on actual eggs and sand shrimp in the water soluble. I'll use that anise krill scent mix also with like jigs and things like that. Really turns trout on. But nonetheless, these guys here are another alternative, but they're no longer manufactured. You can't get them anymore. So if you if you're interested in getting drift bobbers like these, you got to really start stocking like, I can't say enough about the iFish forum. It's ifish.net. If you're not already signed up for it, go over there. It's a free account to sign up. You introduce yourself to everybody in the community. A lot of folks from my neck of the woods, the Pacific Northwest. But really cool stuff. And sometimes people are selling stuff on there. Or you go on Craigslist or the Facebook Marketplace and you look for the folks that are doing kind of they've done steelhead fishing in the past. Now, for those of you that are from the Great Lakes region that are fishing no steelhead, you may not have access to a lot of this stuff. Here in the Pacific Northwest, steelhead fishing, it's just kind of a part of our life here. When you go to a river, you know there's going to be three species in there: trout, salmon, steelhead. They're going to be their different seasons. Trout are usually resident, though. But you can find a lot more of this stuff in the Pacific Northwest than you can maybe in the Great Lakes region where they also have steelhead, or maybe even in like the Northern California region. You're going to find more in British Columbia, Alaska, those types of areas. So yeah, the spoons in the Great Lakes. So we use a lot of spoons here too. And I'm glad that I have another Great Lake angler on here. So me being Pacific Northwest, I'm fishing for fish that are coming out of the salt. I have never been able to get a straight answer from anybody on what the steelhead are actually feeding on out in the Great Lakes. Are they feeding on freshwater shrimp? Are they feeding on bait fish? Are they feeding on bugs? Are they behaving more like a trout in a lake where they're going down and they're kicking up scuds and chironomids and things like that? Never really got a straight answer on that. But one thing I do know is that the beads are kind of the business, especially with the folks that really like to hammer down with the center pin stuff and everything else. So I would highly encourage outside of the spoon and the spinner fishery, because the best way I ever heard that equated was that there's another channel on YouTube here, and it's called The Bite. I would highly suggest that you subscribe to those guys. Super cool guys. They're from here in Oregon. They do a lot of steelhead fishing, a lot of jetty fishing. However, one of the dudes on The Bite said that we run everything subtle through this hole. And steelhead are such ambush predators. You can run something through there 20 times, and 21st time, kaboom, you got a fish. I would suggest sliding over there, subscribing to their channel, and following their stuff. But what he said about spinners and spoons was, we've ran everything nice and subtle and quiet through there. You want to throw a fire truck through there, throw a spoon, throw a spinner. That's really what it comes down to. So that's a really loud presentation. Now, I'm not saying the steelhead are timid, but what I'm saying is that usually my pattern of sequence when I fish a run, if I'm drift fishing a run, is that I'm going to drift X amount of river. So let's say I get a really good like half-mile stretch. Okay, so bait fish and insects. Okay, that makes sense. And that's what I was kind of thinking. Maybe like shad or some of the smaller fish that are out there, maybe chubs or anything that's out there in the main lake. They will eat it. They're very they will assault. But I would try egg mimickers. And for that, like if you wanted to bust something out that I don't know if you get a lot of that are coming out of Lake Michigan, I would highly suggest trying some of these polystyrene hard drift bobbers. They're just so fantastic. You can get corkies. Okay, corkies are made. Let's see. So at the beginning of my video, I talked about this book, and if you go back and you watch this, you'll be able to see. But corkies are made by Yakima Bait Company, and they're still manufactured. You go into any fishing supply store here in the Pacific Northwest, and there's bins and bins and bins of these. And so you can see I have tons of these. I not only use them for indicators at the top of my float fishing setups, just because it gives extra visibility, essentially. But when I am fishing them, I'm using them to actually float the baits and keep them up off the bottom as I drift fish. Let me go back really quick here. So, great resource for anybody. A Color Guide to Steelhead Drift Fishing. This is written by Bill Hertzog. Now, Amato Media also puts out a book or a publication, and it's called The Great Lakes Angler. Now, they also have Salmon Trout Steelheader magazine. Obviously, you can see there's a nice Chinook on the cover. And so you can definitely get some better resources there. So your question on fishing them under a float versus fishing them drift style. My experience is that because you're already under float, okay, if you're running a fixed float, this is not the way to fish. If you're running a slip float and you have weight and you can get your weight to go down to the bottom and basically dredge bottom with that drifting through, then using a slip float, one would be a bobber dog float. The other one could be a vertical float. A bobber dogging float with the flat bottom where it actually tows and drags this is going to be your best option for presentation under a float. If you're looking to actually drift fish this, that is the ultimate way to use these drift bobbers, because not only is the drift bobber going to give buoyancy to the bait as it floats through the drift, you'll have a leader. Typically 24 inches is about as long of a leader as you want to go. So you'll run your hook, your drift bobber with your bait, yarn, whatever you want, your leader out 24 inches, and then you'll put either a 2-way or a 3-way swivel, depending on the type of weight you want to use. Now you could use pencil lead, you could use what we call tangle-free weights, which are basically lead-free type weights. You can also use slinkies. Slinkies are a different type of drift weight, and the slinky will actually knock against the rocks. Slinkies work really good for bobber dog fishing, but we'll go back to the actual drift fishing. You can also take solid core pencil lead and you can put surgical tubing around it, and you can clip that into a 3-way swivel with a drop clevis, and that's another good way. But basically, hard plastic or hard polystyrene type floats are best drift fished. That's been my experience. Now, soft beads are best under a float, because some soft beads are positive buoyancy, some are neutral, and some are negative. When you're fishing most of your commercially made soft beads, they're going to be what we call a neutral buoyancy bead. If you put too heavy of a hook on it, it's going to drag it right to the bottom. But you put a lighter hook on it, it's going to stay kind of in that strike zone. That's what makes them so deadly. These are all positive buoyancy, so they have to have something to hold them down. And that's where the drift fishing comes into play. They're actually they're gonna drift through that run, and they're gonna be maybe bump, they're gonna knock a rock, and your weight's gonna go up here and dunk, dunk, and it's gonna kind of bounce through that run sequentially with that drift bobber. So that's kind of one of those things. Sorry, I'm getting a call there. I just had to cancel it. That's one of those things with these types of drift bobbers is that you want to have them down, and you want them just basically hanging out in that strike zone. Great Lakes, you have shallower, clearer rivers. One of my good friends over on Instagram, he's been pounding on Steelhead. He shows me a picture of the river. It's 8 inches deep, 10 inches deep. I show people pictures of the rivers around here, and we have 8 to 12 foot holes with 4,000 CFS pumping through them. Big difference in fisheries. I would say that you're going to probably go very, very light tackle in your rivers. So as far as what I would start out with, if I was going to be drift fishing steelhead in the Great Lakes region, and I haven't fished steelhead in the Great Lakes region, I've only fished your most common fish, and that's going to be your muskie, walleye, those types of fish. So I've never actually been able to put boots on the ground on a river to fish in the Great Lakes. Eventually I will. I would start out with very small stuff. I don't think I would go much larger than, and this is based on what I've observed. Now, I could be totally wrong. Maybe you just need to run just a big, nasty bait presentation through there because everybody's running something small. Maybe you need to have that visibility in that run. But I'm going to say size 10, 12, and 14 of any type of drift bobber is what I would personally start with. So you're talking about like a size 12, in this case, an okie drifter. that's what I would start out with. I would start with a 14 to 12, a very small, subtle presentation. Run it on 10-pound fluoro. Run 24 inches of that with, in this case, a number 4 hook is going to be all you need on that. The number 4 hook is going to actually extend past that. It's going to be light enough. I wouldn't go with something that's got a really heavy shank on the hook. I would go with the lightest shank I could find. Gamakatsu makes some fabulous hooks that are very lightweight. So does Mustad, VMC, Eagle Claw, any of them. You know, honestly, just pick your hook brand. I'm a Gamakatsu fan. I've caught a lot of fish on them. They stay sharp. They're real solid. Okay, and I haven't had any of them bend out. Eagle Claws, I've straightened. So I'm just speaking from experience. Okay, and that's straightening on rocks. That's straightening in fish's mouths too. So thankfully, I had a barb. But and some people are like, oh no barbs. When you're fishing big angry fish that will straighten hooks, barbs are okay, especially when it's not banned in the river. Okay, if it is banned in the river, then follow the regulations and obviously go barbless. But like a number, a 14, a 10, 12, 14 with a number 4 or a number 6 hook. Okay, keep that hook to where it's not going to necessarily drag your bobber down. Keep it up there drifting, and that's what I would suggest starting with. 24 inches, 10-pound test, fluorocarbon leader. Run a piece of hollow core pencil lead or a tangle-free weight. Probably gonna, depending on your drift speed. Remember, you're gonna want to tick, so it'll run and go ba-boom, ba-boom, about once every second. Now, that's what a lot of the books say. This has been my experience. If you're getting dut 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 and you're bouncing on the bottom, just remember that drift bobber's staying up there in the strike zone. Keep it down in that strike zone. That's going to be your most helpful thing, is to keep that drift bobber in the strike zone. Do not let the hydraulics force it up to the surface. That's going to be, once it surfaces, it's basically useless. That's what I would say. So keep it down there in the strike zone. If you notice that there's a little bit too much buoyancy, start by adding a little bit of weight to the hook end. So yarn. Yarn gets wet, yarn holds scent, yarn hangs up in the fish's teeth. Okay? So, yeah, definitely try to set up this spring. It's totally worth it, especially as the fish start pushing through and everything else. That yarn, though, can hang up in the fish's teeth as they go, arr, they're going to eat, and that yarn's going to hang up because they got the little needles. They're trout, or steelhead, or salmon. Hangs up, gets that hook spun around, and by the time you feel the thunk, 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 you're able to reel down on it. Another tip, don't necessarily do a jacking hook set. Okay, reel down until you feel the thud, 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 and then really give just a nice twist. If your hook's sharp enough, it's going to penetrate the fish's mouth. So, those would be my suggestions, especially in the realm of the Great Lakes. So, I'm going to wrap up this video here, but please, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, leave us a like, shoot us over some questions too. We pop into these lives at random, and it's always fun to share some of this different stuff, because I always hear about people talking about, like, oh, what's a spinning glow? What's a corky? What's a birdie drifter? What's a okie drifter? What's a cheater? I wanted to give a little bit of explanation to each one of those and give you guys some other alternative resources to go out and learn more about different fishing styles. And I don't care what kind of fish you want to go out and catch. Go catch whatever you want. But these are just different pieces of tackle. It's always fun to talk about tackle. I think colors of tackle are one of the biggest attractors to us as fishermen. We see the big flashy thing or something like that, and it's always a lot of fun. So, nonetheless, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Thank you, everybody that stopped in. I know there wasn't a whole bunch of you here, but wanted to bring you just a little bit of fishing content. So, until next time, make sure you subscribe, slide on over to Spotify, follow us over there, listen to some of our podcast episodes, and thanks for joining us today.